Yeah.
I want to introduce myself first. My name is Maureen Bonanno. I'm one of the Greenwich High School PTA co-presidents. Welcome to our very first webinar. We hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. We've been keeping very, very busy at the PTA, doing our normal business, kind of normal. But throughout the year, we do informational meetings, and so we wanted to continue to do that for our members. So since we recognize this is such a challenging time for all of us, we thought it would be helpful to host this session to help you navigate through difficult topics associated with the pandemic, including anxiety, depression, grief, loss, and social distancing, all the tough issues that our teens are going through. So with that, we want to just thank you for joining us. I know you're probably really busy, and I'm going to turn this over now to Layla Horn, who's our VP of Parent Education, so she can introduce our speakers for the evening.
Hi everyone, my name is Layla Horn. I'm the VP of Parent Education at Greenwich High School, and I wanted to say thank you to these wonderful ladies who will be presenting tonight. Some of you may have met Suzanna back in January. We had also a panel at Greenwich High School, but they're both, very experienced professionals, and I'll give you a little bit of background. You did receive this information in the email, but really quick, Suzanna, who will be presenting first, Narducci, is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a therapist in private practice in New York City and Connecticut. She received her MSW from New York University and her training at the National Institute for the Psychotherapies and AEDP Institute. Using neuroscience and attachment theory, Suzanna counsels adults and couples with trauma history. She helps clients regulate all types of anxiety and develop a deep understanding of their emotional selves to allow healing, develop stronger connections, and strengthen psychological resilience. Cristina Young, who will be presenting second, is a licensed clinical social worker in Greenwich as well. Cristina has more than 25 years experience providing professional support to children, adolescents, adults in a variety of settings. In her roles as parent educator, school counselor, admissions officer, teacher, and therapist, has gained a deep understanding of family systems and human behavior. Having trained at the Beck Institute in Philadelphia on the use of cognitive behavioral therapy and being a certified positive discipline educator, Cristina's background provides her with the underpinnings necessary to help adults make the changes they desire. She currently facilitates parenting groups, leads in-depth workshops on parenting topics, and presents in schools and organizations. Cristina received her master's in social work from the University of Southern California and her bachelor's in teaching degree from Barnard College, Columbia University. She and her husband have 3 children, aged 20, 18, and 15. So thank you to both of you for being here. And just as a reminder, the microphone for the participants will be muted until the very end, until the Q&A section. And if you think of questions while the speakers are presenting, you can send them in the chat function, and then we will review them and hopefully get through all of the questions at the end, depending on how long it takes. But thank you everyone for being here, and we feel this is a very important topic, so enjoy the webinar.
Hi everybody, it's nice to see, well I can't see you all, but it's nice to be with all of you. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us. So while Cristina is going to address a lot of issues related to parenting, my goal is to help everybody sort of understand their own emotions in this, in that when we understand our emotions, we are able to really be more regulated and therefore help our children as well. So the first section, as you can probably see on your handout, is understanding and coping with anxiety and depression. One of the most important things or messages I'd like to get across is that all feelings are normal. Our nervous systems are wired to feel this way. Whatever feelings are coming up, we are wired to feel that way. There are 3 states of our nervous system. The first one, you'll be familiar with all of these. There's more technical terms, but I don't want to throw a lot of jargon your way. But the first state is the most primeval state, is the rich state in evolution that we had first, is the freeze state. The second state is fight flight, which is a state of anxiety, which most of us are in at this point. And there's also a state of connectedness, which we hear less about, but is really the desirable state. The truth is that in a healthy nervous system, we're going to experience all of these states. So for example, in the pre-COVID days, when we might have ridden the New York City subway system, we might have at one point, hopefully not, come across somebody who was acting erratically. If that was happening, what we might do is we're hearing them banging the pole, we're hearing them shouting to themselves, maybe making comments that are aggressive. So if it's really bad, our system might shut down. We might experience a freeze state. This is the state that when we were being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, that we would go into. It's don't see me now, I'm an opossum, I don't want to be, don't kill me, don't see me sort of thing. Then when the subway doors opened, we would immediately, and this is without our body, our mind's knowledge, this all happens through neuroreceptors at very deep levels of the unconscious. So we might immediately jump into a fight-flight stage. We can run out, we can get ourselves to safety. Our heart might be beating really, really quickly. We might be sweating, we might be breathing heavily, and tightness in our chest. And then we would run up the stairs, get to safety. And if we're going to connect with all of our nervous system, then we would jump into the connected part. And that's where we would pick up our cell phone, call a loved one. We might cry because all of a sudden we felt safe and connected with somebody. And this is where we can actually really feel and be with our emotions on a deep and meaningful level. So this is really to say that all of these states and everything that we're experiencing right now is necessary and it helps us survive. The trick, however, is not to hang out in the freeze or fight-flight state for too long. If you have that for too long, then there are a lot of side effects that aren't so positive. And some of them are mental health side effects and some of them are physical side effects. In addition to this, we also want to understand that depression and anger are normal. And depression often happens when we've been in a state of anxiety. Like, for example, we all been running to the grocery store, certainly at the beginning of March. We were going and buying toilet paper. We heard that that was out. We were stocking up on canned goods. We really wanted to make sure that our families were safe and we were going to survive this. So that anxiety, that's like, okay, we don't want to overdo it. We want to be reasonable, but we're doing things that are protective for ourselves and our families. However, if we stay in that state and we're still there a month, 2 months into it, some of us might start to feel depressed because we're running all this anxiety and there's no place for it to go. There's no release. And then we're just tired and we're exhausted. And sometimes a feeling of helplessness can kick in. This is normal, but also something to watch out for and something we don't really want to be in these states for, again, extended lengths of time. But at the same time, what's been fascinating to me as a therapist is that I've noticed, both with my friends and with my clients, of a collective experience, depending on, if you got quarantined early or, have been social distancing, depending on where you were on the trajectory, most people have been going through all these stages. So, what we need to do is really learn how to self-regulate. And that's one of my biggest things is if we can self-regulate, that helps us stay in these, manage these states and move up to a place of connectedness sooner. So one of the ways to self-regulate is we want to separate ourselves from our emotions. We want to notice our emotions, acknowledge our emotions. We don't want to ignore them. Be curious about them. That's something in the state of connectedness that we have a lot of curiosity and we don't want to be overwhelmed by them. So viewing emotions as just a part of our experience rather than all of us really helps. And one another way to regulate is we want to remind ourselves that we are safe. We want to proactively let our bodies know that we are okay. So we're countering the feelings of anxiety. And I'll go into this in more detail later. We are living in close quarters with our families, sometimes extended families, and emotions are contagious. This is due to something called mirror neurons, which is something they've started to do a lot of research in the last, I think, 15 years. I don't know if you've noticed, but you can be in an okay mood, and then all of a sudden somebody can walk in the room. They're not saying anything, but your mood can switch. You can experience sadness, frustration, anger, and go, why am I feeling this? Where did it come from? And that is because potentially you could be with somebody who's having a strong emotional internal reaction to something, and you're actually picking up on what's going on with them. So mirror neurons explain our ability to feel empathy, our ability to read facial expressions, to feel the suffering and pain of another. Like when we watch a movie, we really feel it, as well as share joy. One way of looking at it is, remember when our children were babies and we would, before they had language, some of their needs were quite simple, but after a while you were able to pick up slightly more complicated needs almost intuitively. And that was because the more connected you are with somebody, the more you are able to read their mirror neurons. We always want to not assume that we have it, that we're reading something and we don't want to do mind reading. That's not positive. But if you're feeling something that you feel might not be yours, in a very gentle, kind way, just ask. I'm just curious, I've been feeling this way and I'm wondering if you're feeling some of this too. And my belief is a family mantra, and you post it on your refrigerator, is that we should all be responsible for the energy that we bring into the room. So moving on beyond that is, how do we move beyond anxiety and depression? So what we have to understand is that there are two different types of feelings that offer a release and feelings that can keep us stuck. Feelings get released because when they are experienced, they have an adaptive action. Feelings that get stuck are cyclical and have a ruminative thought pattern. So we've all had that, where we're stuck in a thought, we can't release it, as opposed to if we have a good cry, then we feel better, we feel lighter. Feelings that get released are sadness, grief, fear, anger, joy, excitement, and disgust. Feelings that get us stuck are anxiety, shame, guilt, and depression. So what we need to do is we need to get in touch with these feelings, the feelings that lie beneath the anxiety and depression. And often, for many of us in the pandemic, some of those feelings of anxiety and the depression is sort of a side shoot of that, is our feelings of sadness at our own loss, and sadness for all of those around us. There can also be feelings of anger, which are normal. Again, we don't want to act out on them. If we see somebody being careless about social distancing, we might feel angry because we feel threatened by it. And sometimes if somebody's not feeling that we're doing enough, they may feel angry towards us as well. Feeling productive emotions also offer a relief. And once we get to that relief and that adaptive action, we get to a deepening of knowledge about ourselves. In order to move beyond anxiety and depression, we need to develop insight. And many of us have this, but I really believe this is something that we work to cultivate for our entire lives. We have to remember that what we feel does not define us. Insight is held in the temporal lobe of the brain. And the more we have the ability to access this when we're in a deep feeling motion of any emotion, but the more we can access this part of our brain, the more it helps us self-regulate. Insight gives us the ability that when we release the emotions, it allows us to understand. It will automatically come up what the adaptive action is. We need to recognize that what we're feeling is just a feeling and be curious about it, and that it does not define us. So relieving anxiety and depression is really the key, because we can talk about it, we can understand it, but it's another thing to relieve it. So all productive emotions start in the body. Research in neurobiology tells us that this is true. It says, however, that anxiety, however, is experienced in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is where cognitive thought is experienced. And these anxiety, as we discussed, can become a cyclical pattern of thought that does not allow us any rest. So what I want to try and do is an exercise, if you will all bear with me, so that you can experience what I'm talking about. We all have an experience of anxiety in our bodies. So if you can find a place where you're sitting, and put your feet firmly on the ground. You can't see mine, but I've just uncrossed my legs and done that. And then I want you to lean back in whatever chair that you have. And I want you to close your eyes, if that's okay, and locate the somatic feeling, the sensory feeling of anxiety that we are all carrying in your body. It's different for everybody, but it's all there. And feeling your feet firmly on the ground, your legs in the chair, your back against your chair or your sofa, and taking a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, and release. Again. 1, 2, 3, and release. All the time, noticing the somatic feeling, the sensory feeling of anxiety in your body. Just being with it, not judging, not adding thoughts to it. Just noticing the sensations where it is, while being in the safety of your home, hearing the safety of my voice, the safety of the room around you. You're feeling your feet firmly on the ground. Breathing deeply. 1, 2, 3. And exhaling. Noticing. Not judging. Just being with. Just stay here for just a few more seconds. Noticing. So, thank you everybody for doing this exercise with me. And I didn't do it for a very long time because I want to make sure we have a lot of information to share. But I'm curious, were you able to feel your anxiety lower? It's different for everybody. I'm seeing a nod. Thank you, Maureen. That's helpful. And from Cristina, thank you. So this is what happens. We're able to be inside our bodies. It's paradoxical, but anxiety comes when we're running away from the feelings in our bodies. And the more we can center ourselves in our bodies, the more we are able to stay centered and lower anxiety. And part of that is we are connecting to ourselves in the present moment and here in the now. We are not worried about the past or the future. We know that we are here and now, present with ourselves and safe. And this also works when we connect to others, especially loved others. So going back to what I was talking about earlier, we want to let our nervous systems know that we are safe. So in order to reduce anxiety, what we do is we slow down. And so we can just do this for ourselves. We just did it now. Slow, deep breathing. The use of speech, you heard it in my tone, the speed of my voice. All forms of exercise, it goes the other direction too. I think, Cristina, you're going to talk more about this. But chemicals are released when we have aerobic exercise that satisfy the flight, fight part of our nervous system. We felt like we've outrun the saber-toothed tiger, we're safe, we can now relax. So it's really a way of tricking our bodies into it. And again, always checking in and being somatically aware of our bodies. Connecting with others is through our facial expressions, the tone of our voice, with permission, physical touch, a heartfelt, meaningful hug goes a long, long way. Playfulness is a great way of connecting with people. Because again, we're present. We're telling our nervous system it's okay. We can play. We can't play when we're scared. This type of communication is not about content. It is about connection on a feeling level. And for your kids, this will make a huge difference no matter what their age is, and your partner for that matter. Being focused on each other in the present moment lowers anxiety because we are safe, cared for, and less able to worry about the past or the future. And finally, although I have much more to say, another way of staying present is being connected with something greater than ourselves, developing a sense of awe. So to me, walking in nature does that. I see something greater than myself, something magnificent. The amount of birds that are out now is absolutely incredible to me. seeing early on in this, seeing the families, the people in Italy singing from their balconies in solidarity just gave me a sense of awe of the greatness of the human race in the midst of this great tragedy. Our healthcare workers put me in awe every day. And the people who show up at our factories, at our grocery stores, again. So I hold a place of awe and gratitude, and that also lowers, I don't do it because it lowers my anxiety, but it does lower my anxiety. So in the midst of this, we also have to learn how to manage grief and loss. So to understand this, we want to understand grief as on a spectrum. At one of this end of the spectrum is the grief of, I miss going out to my restaurants. I'm so sick of cooking at this point. For my family, I can't even begin to tell you. And so that is my very small sense of loss, which I'm sure that everyone can relate to. I keep joking around, I'm not going to cook for a year after I get the friggin' vaccine. I'm done. And I like cooking. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the gut-wrenching sadness that we can feel related to the death of a loved one. So this is the whole spectrum. It's all normal. It's all to be expected. So the counterpoint to grief is living life to the fullest. Grief is really the deep sadness that acknowledges our ability to love and live life to the fullest. Anxiety is the emotion that fears grief. It fears our experience of grief and gets in the way of our being fully present with the, fully present in our lives. When we live wholeheartedly, we are on some level accepting that we will also grieve. Grief is the counterpoint to love, joy, and delight. You cannot experience one without the potential of the other. So this goes to our pre-COVID lives. We have to take risk. We have to live wholeheartedly. We have to, on some level of our unconscious, we're acknowledging that we risk losing something when we celebrate something. And sometimes I've wondered in our pre-COVID lives, myself included, if we've been blessed with so much that we have lived with a disproportionate amount of anxiety because we are afraid to lose what we have. Our fear of loss has caused us not to live wholeheartedly. So it's just something to think about. We're in a time where many of us we've had a pause in a way, and we're rethinking our lives, what works and what doesn't work. So this is just something I'd love you to take away. And sometimes people, I know I've had this experience, have suffered early losses in their lives that are quite severe. And these losses can cause us to retreat and not fully invest our love in those that we care about, or it makes it frightening to do that. So in our lives, we have to live our life at its fullest. We have to accept and be willing to take the risk that we will experience deep, gut-wrenching sadness. So how do we do this? How do we live wholeheartedly? We have to find the emotions underneath our anxiety, or also defenses. I like defenses as a positive thing. It's what's protected us in our lives. Both anxiety and defenses of what has protected us from seemingly unbearable emotions. And these unbearable emotions, often in truth, are productive or core emotions. So I'll start to refer to them as core emotions. And as I said before, these are fear, anger, grief, joy, disgust, happiness, and surprise. Core emotions are experienced in a wave of feeling that only lasts 3 minutes at most. At the end of this wave is relief, and often we get in touch with a deeper knowledge about ourselves, as well as our ability to be resilient, and sometimes a profound sense of gratitude. Knowing that we can experience intense emotions and come out wiser gives us faith in ourselves to live our lives wholeheartedly. And this is something, again, that we can talk about, but in order to really go through it, you have to experience it. And the difference, moving on, the difference between grief and depression is that depression, unlike grief, does not offer relief. I sort of went into that, and again, inhibitory emotions are anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, because they're cyclical, they're in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. And as I mentioned before, we get exhausted from anxiety. We can be exhausted from depression as well, although we're so shut down, we don't always notice it. Shame is often very hidden away, but takes a lot of energy as well as guilt. So we need to figure out when to get help. So we all have varying degrees of ruminative thought. However, what I want everyone to know, and what many people don't know, it is possible to get permanent relief from this way of thinking. Neurological pathways in this way of thinking, and the human mind is wired to favor the negative because that's what's kept us alive. But our brain is plastic. It doesn't have to stay this way. So even though we may have neurological pathways that are entrenched in negative thinking, and it's sometimes difficult to shift out of this way of thinking, it is possible for this to happen. However, if you see somebody and you're worried about them, and you're concerned they may have severe depression, you should look out. These are the things you should look out for. And I covered some of this the last time I talked at Greenwich High School. Is hopelessness, feelings of being a burden to others, increased use of substances, withdrawal, change in sleep habits, and loss of interest. As I said before, always ask if somebody's upset, or always be with somebody in their emotions. Never be afraid that you're going to provoke more emotions by asking. If they're there, they have them. Have an ongoing conversation. It doesn't need to be just one conversation. People shift over time with their emotions. And the most important thing that you can find out is don't be afraid to ask if they have feelings about hurting themselves. You can normalize it and say, most people have feelings of suicide ideation, but I want to be here with your feelings. They're just a feeling. It's temporary, but I'm here and I care. Please tell me what's going on. I'm so curious. So there's no judgment. But most importantly, find out if they have a plan and if they have the means to implement a plan. And that means you should get immediate help if they do. So, as I mentioned before, grief offers relief. Grief is a core emotion because the emotions are able to be released. All our inhibitory emotions give way to core emotions when we understand them and we understand why we have them. Once we are connected to our core emotions, our anxiety, depression, and other emotions will fall away. We are then not only able to connect to ourselves truly in those moments, we are also able to develop a deeper, more meaningful connections to those that we love. And as well as that, we discover the truth about ourselves. Once we are in touch with our true feelings, the truth about ourselves is always revealed. And sometimes this is something that frightens people and keeps them away from wanting to feel those feelings. But I have never in my entire experience known any other therapist to have this, as well as myself, that it hasn't always been a good truth that has been really revealed. Even if you've been through something absolutely awful, once you understand yourself and your own behaviors, you will end up feeling that good things about yourself, that you're resilient, that you are strong, that you did a lot to take care of yourself, and you will then feel more connected to yourself and your life experiences. So I'm just looking at time. Yes, okay, so I want to keep going. So basically, the bottom line is we want to be connected to ourselves, our loved others, and something greater than ourselves. Being connected gives us the visceral experience of being safe, which allows our nervous system to access feelings that may not have been able to be previously felt. When we feel safe, we feel understood. So just quickly, when we return, some of us are going to experience PTSD, and that is normal. This is really scary what we've been through. We've now hunkered down. We felt safe hunkering down. And so re-entry has the potential to be difficult. And again, whatever you're feeling is completely normal. And so to just hang on to that. Signs of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, are intrusive memories, avoidance of things, negative thought changes in thought or mood, and changes in physical and emotional reactions. Again, this is a normal response to trauma. When we go through big or small traumatic events, sometimes our emotional system is overwhelmed and not able to process it. So afterwards is when we need to do the release. It's good if we can do it during, but if we can't, that's okay. And that is because emotion gets stuck and held up in the part of the brain called the amygdala. So again, we want to work through to the release. And it really helps to release these emotions in the presence of a kind and caring other who understands how not to emotionally overwhelm our system. Often in traumatic moments, it's that sense of aloneness that has really heightened the sense of the feeling of trauma. So if we can be connected to ourselves and others during this time, that is definitely going to help lower our experience of trauma. And I think knowing that this is a collective worldwide experience and that we're all experiencing this together, and we focus on that, that normalization takes away the shame of feeling like, why am I not being able to manage this? And again, healing relationships, self-compassion, empowerment, routine, safety, exercise, and limited media exposure really help during traumatic experiences lower the impact of trauma. And again, media exposure, I would just do as little of it as you possibly can. It puts our nervous system right back into fight-flight mode. And then just to be hopeful, because there's so much to be hopeful for, and we will all get through this, and it will be fine. I mean, there will be losses. And anybody who's experienced that, I am truly sorry. But we are resilient, and we will be able to help our families forward. So just know, our brain is plastic. We're never stuck in anything, and we are built to be resilient. It's why the human race survives. Undoing the aloneness of the experience is key, as I mentioned. There's no shame in our feelings ever, and make as many meaningful connections in this as you possibly can. And that is my presentation. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. And I'm passing the torch to Cristina.
Thank you so much, Suzanna. So let me just start by saying that was fantastic. And I was taking notes on your presentation, so that was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to Layla. Thank you to Maureen. Thank you to Greenwich High School for hosting me. And it's delightful to do this with you, Suzanna. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being here tonight. You could be watching Netflix. You could be making dinner with your family. You could be getting takeout. There are a million things you could be doing. So the fact that you're choosing to sit here with us for a good chunk of time already tells me a lot about who you are as adults. You're caring parents, and I admire that. So I want to start by talking about self-care, and I want you to imagine for a minute that life is normal and you're allowed to go on an airplane. So you and your family board the plane, you're heading to Florida, and you hear the very familiar directive, please put your own oxygen mask on before you help others. We've all heard it a million times. I was thinking about this directive and why is it so important, metaphorically, especially right now? And it's because we, the adults, need to remain as calm and anchored as possible in the face of uncertainty and turbulence in our life. And the thing is, our kids are reading our faces to decide how to proceed. So we're modeling all the time. Should we be panicked, or should we be okay? We're okay. We're getting through all of this. I would argue that self-care has never been more important. And the reason is this: when we as humans experience something new, we're always in a state of anxiety, even if the new thing is a happy, exciting thing, which this is not. So you take the combination of this whole period of quarantine is terrifying. There's so many unknowns. Plus, none of us have done this before. Nobody's an expert. Nobody is allowed to say, oh, no, I know exactly what's going to happen next. So that is a collective state of anxiety that we're feeling. And what do we do when we have anxiety? Suzanna has already told you quite a few things, but another thing to really focus on is your most excellent self-care possible. So let's do a deep dive into self-care together. And I want to start with the obvious, but I'm going to go super quick because they're so obvious. This isn't an ideal world, which none of us live in, but 30 minutes of being outside every day, 30 minutes of exercising every day, 30 minutes of peer interaction. That's not even your partner or your spouse. That's another adult, like a good friend. And then humor every single day, whether you're watching YouTube videos or looking at memes that people are sending you or whatever it is. I mean, if I asked everybody to raise their hand, and I can't see you all, but nobody would be raising their hand saying, oh yeah, I'm hitting all of those every day. That's not happening. But we want to set the bar high. So that's what setting the bar high sounds like. Now let's look at what I like to call the sustainability bucket. So I love this notion because I am always interested in what can my current self do as a gift to my future self. So I'm thinking about my current May self and what are the drops that I can put in my sustainability bucket so that I used to say June self, but it's sounding like it might be my August self, will say, thank you so much, May version of myself. Thank you for eating that orange. Thank you for going on that run. Thank you for doing that yoga YouTube class again. Whatever it is, these are things that we put in our bucket because this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And we need sustainability out of ourselves, obviously, so that we can help nurture our families. Question about the sustainability that I want you to think about is this: what gets in the way of your sustainability? What are the obstacles that you grapple with? And how much of that can you control? And how much of it is out of your control? I don't have the answers for you, but it's something very interesting to think about all the time. What are the variables that I can control and which ones can I not control? Let's move on to talking about the self-care toolbox. And I want to remind you that anything I talk about tonight, I'm hoping you're going to teach your teenagers as well, because it all applies to you as the parent, but absolutely to your kids as well. So the self-care toolbox I love, and essentially it is you taking the time to set up, and it can look a lot of different ways. It could be like a I love me binder, I've heard people call it. It could be a basket that you keep by your bedside. It's a sensory related set of items. Maybe it's eucalyptus oil, lavender oil, beanbag chair, massage roller, favorite music, favorite photos. It's something that deeply immerses you in your senses so that you are distracted and nurtured at the same time with your own self-care. Here's the tricky thing about self-care. No one's gonna do it for you. You have to make the decision. I need a good toolbox of self-care tips, and I'm going to take the time to set those up. The second tricky thing about self-care is this, and we really need you to teach your kids this. They're not born with the instinct to know when to use good self-care, when to dip into that self-care bucket or that self-care toolkit. So you might need to observe them during the day, and then gently, especially with teenagers, very gently say, it looks like you're having a hard time. Would this evening be a good time to dip into that basket of self-care tools that we've set up together? But they're going to need you to guide them towards that. It doesn't happen instinctually. Another aspect of good self-care has to do with noticing patterns in yourself. So anytime we can notice a pattern, it gives us an edge. It gives us a distinct advantage because then we know, oh, I have a feeling this is going to happen. And that way I'm not going to be hijacked by my emotions. I'm not going to be blindsided by what's happening. So an example is a lot of people say, gosh, I do fine during the day, but when the sun goes down, I tend to feel quite low, right? Okay, if you know that about yourself, then maybe you set up, you know what, at 7 o'clock every day, I'm going to do a Zoom call with my best friend. And maybe the expectations are low. 3 minutes. Hi, how was your day? Mine was miserable. Are you okay? Yes, I'm going to go have a glass of wine, talk to you later. Or maybe you really get 15 minutes talking to your best friend. But it's that notion of understanding the pattern and setting up a response to that pattern. Maybe just one other example, I've heard a lot of people talking about disrupted sleep. So put a journal by your bedside. If you wake up, jot down the stuff that's keeping you up. Take it out of your head, name it to tame it, get it on paper, and see if that doesn't reduce some of the anxious thoughts, the ruminating that Suzanna was talking about, swirling in your head. Smart adults ask for help. I really love this tool for myself, but I love teaching it to teenagers. And the reminder is just think about the smartest adults that you know. They are never the ones who sit back and say, I've got it all figured out. I don't have any questions. I'm fine. They're always the ones who say, hang on, I've got a question. Hang on, I misunderstood you. Can you say that again, right? Those are the adults who know when to clarify. They know when to lean on somebody. So the smartest adults are the ones who recognize, you know what, this is almost 7 weeks, I think we've been doing this, and I'm falling apart. I need to lean on you. Those are the people that I have the most respect for. They're able to name that emotion and seek out the help. Tell your kids about those people. Tell them about the neighbor who called you up in tears and said, I'm really having a hard time. And let them know how much you admire that person for reaching out for help. Let's talk about the care of your teens. So we've talked now about self-care, and I want to move into how do we talk about caring for our teens once we've secured our own self-care, right? We've put our oxygen mask on, now we're stable, and we can look at what's happening with our teens. And I've heard a lot of moms in the groups that I run weekly saying, I don't understand what they're doing. I'm watching them do all of this stuff, and what is going on, right? So it's important to just start with some of the very basics about your teenager. And even one step before that, I just want to remind you, you need clarity yourself, along with your parenting partner, about what matters most. What values does your family stand for, especially right now? When you have excellent clarity in the adults who run the family, then you will know how to make solid decisions. In my home, I'm getting a lot of pushback from my teenagers. Can I go meet everybody in the park? We're all sitting in our trunks. We have to see each other. We have to be able to socialize. I can't make that decision unless I have absolute clarity on, well, what are my values in my family? And what do we stand for? So that's the very first step, is having that clarity. The second step is taking a quick look at our adolescents' brains. And the more we know what's happening under the hood, the more we can proceed in a smart way instead of a reactive way. So for starters, I want to remind you, and all of you remember this, I know this from being a teenager, the number one task they're involved in is called individuating, and all that is a fancy word for pushing away from you and what you stand for. And guess what the quarantine has done? It has absolutely thwarted their effort to individuate. In fact, it has said, hey, you want to regress a couple of years? You want to live in the womb of your family for 7 weeks or a whole lot longer than that? That's the last thing any teenager wants to do. Excuse me. I'm gonna grab a drink. Excuse me. One of the other really important things for teenagers is identifying, wow, this is spring allergies, woo. Identifying with their tribe is huge, right? We're not their tribe anymore. They're done with us. They want to be with their peers, and their peers are the ones who validate their entire existence. So I know in my house what's happening is a lot of frustration because my teenagers are saying, where am I going to get that validation? We're tired of doing Zoom calls. I think all of us, they're tired of being on Zoom. There's a fraction of the validation that you can get on Zoom as you can get in the real world, right? So it's another very frustrating part of this quarantine for these kids. Just another thing we all remember about being a teenager is this quest for novelty and risk-taking. How are you going to do any risk-taking in your home, right? How are you going to seek out anything novel or interesting in your home? It's not happening. So their whole thrust for who they're supposed to be right now, thwarted entirely. I want to just give you this quick hack that I love. All my kids are older than I am. My girls wear more sophisticated clothes and jewelry and makeup, and I can sometimes look at them as they tower above me and think, oh, well, you're like the same age as me, so I'm just going to say it the way I would say it to another adult. And then I remember, hold on now, this prefrontal cortex is not done developing. I mean, girls 25, but those poor boys, we're talking about like 28, 29, 30 years old. So I like to imagine, what if we had a little sticker that we could slap on the forehead of these teenagers, almost like a little crater, and we could just put it there for the rest of their teenage years to remind ourselves, you look older than me, you dress older than me, but you've got a big gaping hole in your brain. You're not done cooking yet. That's why you're making all of these ridiculous decisions using really poor judgment that is startling to us. That's because you have a big gaping hole. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little more about the grief that Suzanna talked about, and I want to talk about it more from the perspective of what can we do as parents, right? We've named this as a grieving process. This is not a dramatic label for what is happening. If we asked everybody on this webinar, can you give me a list of the top 5 losses or disappointments that your teenagers have experienced? We would have a massive list of losses. They're real for these kids, just like we've all experienced our own losses and disappointments. So the very first most important thing I would suggest is this: find a time when you have it in your heart to be empathetic and patient, and sit with your child and allow them to experience that loss with you. So sit in the muck and the discomfort of that grief and that sadness. If you see in yourself, I don't have that in me tonight, I'm all tapped out, I had a really rough day, please don't hang out with your teenager. Take a break, send in reinforcement, tell them, you know what, I gotta go take a shower, I gotta go take a run, maybe I'll talk to you in 2 hours. But if you show up for that conversation when you're supposed to meet them where they are in their grief and you are on empty, it will be very difficult to be empathetic. So I'd rather ask them to hold on a little bit. The other thing I want to remind you is there's no right way to grieve. Grief comes in so many different forms, and some people get stuck in the anger, and some people get stuck in the tears, some people get stuck in resentment. Whatever you're seeing in terms of how your teenager is grieving, that's the right way for them to grieve. It might look very different than the way you grieve, and that's okay. They need you to accept, all right, well, mom sees me grieving, dad sees me grieving. They get it. That's the way I'm going to do it. I have an interesting idea, and it's a concept I came across in an article, and it makes so much sense to me for what's happening right now. It's this term that's called ambiguous grief. And really all this means is that we're mourning all of these losses concurrently while anticipating new losses that will come most likely this summer. When you stop and think about it, that's this big, murky, yucky, overwhelming feeling of grief. For adults, that's a lot to handle. But ask a teenager to handle that, and that's a lot. So what can you do about that? Well, you can name it with your kid. And then you can teach them, you know, there's this concept that has to do with holding 2 thoughts simultaneously in your head. And the idea is, can I think about both and at the same time? So I am mourning the loss of my high school graduation, and I'm comforted by the fact that my mom made my favorite macaroni and cheese, and I'm watching reruns of The Office for the next 6 hours. So I am able to both and grieve and comfort myself at the same time. And if we're looking at silver linings and what are all the takeaways from this very rough period, I would argue great takeaway. Because guess what, kids? In the real world, there will be a million times when you suffer losses. You didn't get the job. That guy didn't ask you out. You didn't get the apartment of your dreams. And you need to be able to say to yourself, wow, I feel that as a loss, and I'm going to meet all my friends tonight for a drink and have a nice dinner, and maybe I'll feel better. So that's a skill that we can highlight in the right moment. And with teenagers, there's only a few of those right moments. I want to remind you of something called a creative replacement. And all I mean by this is that once you've met your child where they are in their grief, and you've really sat with them, and you can tell, and you're the expert on your child, you can tell when they've moved through it a bit, you can say to your child, do you want to talk about some kind of replacement? And in the same breath, you're saying, I get it. It's not as good. This was X. I'm asking you to think about X minus 2. It's not X. I get it. You're very empathetic, but you start talking about, so I'm thinking about the moms I work with in my groups. I've heard so many stories about these birthday parades where the kid was, the saddest one I've heard is like a 16-year-old was meant to go to the DMV and get their permit, right? None of that is happening. So the friends and the families, you know, we've seen all of these on YouTube, they parade by and they've got the horns and the balloons and the posters. It is not X. It is like X minus 15. But it's something, it's a creative replacement. So let's take a look at a couple relationship building tips. We're spending an extraordinary amount of hours together, way more than we normally do. And this tests all of our relationship skills. So I want to start by just defining boundaries for you. And this is the definition that I use. You'll hear plenty of variants on this, but I think of boundaries as this. It's a line that you draw in the sand, and somebody will always be disappointed on the other side of that line. So the choice is this. It can be you, which builds resentment, not a good choice, or it can be someone else, most likely one of your loved ones that you're living with in your house, but somebody's getting disappointed, okay? No one ever wakes up and is like, oh, I'm so psyched, I'm gonna set a boundary today. It's not a joyful process, but it is a process that relieves resentment. So real quickly, I just wanna explain, let's say you're trying to work from home. You might want to say on Sunday, before the Monday workday starts, in a calm manner, hey guys, if you see mom with the big headphones on or the earbuds, do not approach. Use your own brain, ask your sibling, ask the other adult in the house. It means that I'm working. And you, unless the house is on fire, don't approach me. That is setting a clear boundary. I've talked to moms who are putting flags on their desks. Certain color flag means, don't you dare come near me. Another flag is like, I'm just doing my emails. You can approach me if needed, right? Plenty of doors are being shut, but be preemptive in your parenting and be very transparent and say aloud to your teenagers, if the door is shut, you may not open it, you may not knock. It means that I'm on a very important call, and use your brain to be resourceful to figure out another solution to your problem. I also want to talk about kids rising to meet our expectations. When we're in close quarters like this, we can become nitpicky of our partners, of our kids, and vice versa. If you're noticing that sometimes your teens are regressing, I want to start by saying that's very normal, and I'm sorry for you, but it's very normal in these times. What can you do about it? I want you to think about, let's say you have a 15-year-old. And you have noticed on occasion, the 15 is actually starting to act a little bit like a 16 or even a 17, just on a handful of things. You're seeing some maturity. You're seeing some resilience, some resourcefulness. Let the kid know you saw it. Tell them, you know what I noticed about you? The other day you worked out this situation, and that tells me you are almost 16 or whatever age they're about to be. And set the expectation a little bit higher. So now they want to work to meet that expectation. A lot of times parents will tell me, I'm so disappointed in my kids. And they'll tell me the behavior that was disappointing. And I like to respond by asking them, did you ever explicitly state that that behavior was not welcome in your home? And a lot of times, myself included, we just forget because we think it's pretty obvious. But if we don't state an expectation, a child cannot rise to meet that expectation. So keep that one in mind. I really love this tool. I love thinking about Bob the Builder. Do you remember Bob the Builder? And he had the tool belt, right? And like a different tool for every circumstance. There's not one tool. There's like 100 different tools based on what situation, which kid. I like this tool called Circling Back. And it's actually probably of all the tools that I teach parents, it's the one that parents have come back to me and said, I actually use this on my spouse more than my kids. So feel free to use it on your spouse. But here's the notion. It begins with giving yourself permission to delay a response. So I want to tell you a quick story. When my 20-year-old was much younger and starting to socialize with boys, and she really wanted to go to a party. And she had a feeling that I wasn't going to let her go to this party because it became clear the parents weren't going to be home. So she finagled a thing where a friend would text appearing as the mom to me. And I would be like, oh, great, Mrs. Smith, I'm so happy to meet you. I'm glad you're going to be home tonight. Well, my daughter got busted, as they usually do with things like that. And in the moment, I was so disappointed. And that was our oldest. It was our first time dabbling in these kinds of things. And I said to her, you know, I'm so disappointed. I'm going to need some time to think about this. I did not yell. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't call her names. I didn't minimize her. I just said, I got to take a little time to think about this. And in that duration of time, which I purposely made 24 hours, she was on pins and needles, building her muscle for frustration tolerance. How am I going to deal with this? Am I going to get busted? Am I going to lose my phone? Are they going to ground me? She had to wait until I came back around. And that's the part that's called circling back. So when I was no longer escalated, I was very calm and I had had a good sleep. I selected the time, not her, and I went to her and said, now I would like to have a conversation with you about what happened. And that's when I always think about like a washcloth and you're squeezing out every drop of water possible of a washcloth. You squeeze every drop of teachable moments you can get out of that situation. But now it's in a calm conversation instead of when both of you are upset. That's circling back. I'm going to move on to this notion of balancing the bubble between, we have the bubble of home right now, which is safe. We're controlling a lot of the variables. And then we have the external world, which is for kids your ages, TV, iPads, phones, social media galore. How do we manage this? How do we navigate this conversation with our kids? So the first thing I want to suggest is this. Your kids are well aware of everything they want to be well aware of if they have access to any kind of phone or tablet. So it might be interesting once in a while, and timing is everything, once in a while to check in and say to your teenager, what do you make of what's going on in the world? And maybe you don't need to do this if you're a family who sits down for dinner regularly and you either watch the news or you talk about the news, you measure how often, how frequently you need to do this. But starting with a big open-ended question, like what do you make of what's going on in the world, allows your kid to say, yeah, it's a bummer, it sucks. And then they walk away and go do their homework. Or they delve into something that's been very worrisome. Another thing you can ask them, which works for many topics beyond the quarantine and this coronavirus, you can say, what are your friends saying about the situation? And it's a really nice kind of back door into what your own kid is thinking and feeling. It's kind of too direct to come right at them, but it's amazing how much they'll disclose when you don't say, what is Mary thinking or what is John thinking? That's too specific, but just what are your friends thinking? You might be surprised at the information that they're willing to give you. And I guess the overall messaging that I would suggest, again, in terms of we're the adults, we have our oxygen mask on, is this: to be able to say to your kids, if you're noticing them worrying, to be able to say to them, you know what, it seems to me like the experts are doing their jobs. It's really important to let them know adults have jobs, and some of those jobs pertain directly to these situations, pandemics. That is their entire training. That's why they went to school. So the experts are doing their jobs, and it is truthful to say every single day there's progress. That's truthful, right? There's confusion, but there's progress. So if we set the tone of we believe the adults are doing their jobs, it helps set the tone in the house for, okay, it seems like we're making some progress, right? And I guess the other thing I would keep in mind is that you only need to answer the question that your teenager asks. If they ask you one question about the virus or about the news, answer the one question. It doesn't mean that you move into a whole monologue about the situation. That's usually not helpful. I also want to remind you, the silver linings, I hope you've been thinking about them. I hope you've been talking about them. But if you're looking for a positive, to be able to explain to your teens, let's think about the good things that have come out of this and begin to name all the things that you're grateful for. Another just quick note on that is I'm hoping that between now and when the world opens up and turns back to normal, that you have an opportunity, you yourself as the adult, and whether it's in a journal or it's on a Google Doc or in your phone notes, I'm hoping you have the opportunity to jot down your observations and your insights about your growth, your teenager's growth, any little observations, because my concern is that when we go back to normal, it might feel like a tidal wave of emotions, some ecstatic and some trembling and anxious. But what would be an incredible loss, at least from my perspective, is what if we lose track of the silver linings? What if we lose track of those insights? So in my book at this age, I write things down and then I don't lose track of them. I want to also just remind you of this quick term called chunking, and it just has to do with if your kids are overwhelmed with the notion of, oh my gosh, this is going to go on until September, just bring them back to the here and now and just ask them, you know what is it that you want to accomplish just by the end of the week or by the end of the month of May? That's the notion of chunking, just coming back to the here and now. And I'll end with this. I'd love for you to be able to take the time to talk to your kids about their legacy and be able to say, you know, when you narrate this story to your grandkids, how might you narrate it? What is it that you might say to your grandkids? And one thing I know that all of us can help them see is this. You can help your kids to be able to have this legacy. They can say, I was a helper, actually. And the way you do that is by reminding your kids, there are a million ways to be a helper right now. You can FaceTime grandma every day and call yourself a helper. You can bring bottled water to Stanford Hospital and drop it off for the frontline people and call yourself a helper. You can do a photo documentary and walk down the street and photograph things and call yourself a helper. But to have the identity of a helper for our teenagers, I think is a positive outcome for all of the stress that they've had to endure, because when you're a helper, it means that you matter. I want to end by saying thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. And I don't know if you know Glennon Doyle, but she has an amazing book out called Untamed. And in her book, she says this, and this is my mantra for myself and my kids: we can do hard things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cristina. And I wish we had a clapping, I wish it was like a clapping function on Zoom, right? So that we can all like clap, yay, because it's really frustrating, you know, if you do these presentations and you can't. I just wanted to really quickly, before we do want to go to Q&A, but I just wanted to, there still are 48 people with us, which is a lot. So I have one question that I will ask because somebody asked it during the presentation. But then if other people want to ask questions before we unmute you, I think what I would ask is that you go into the chat and sort of say who you are and if you have a question, so I'll call on you. Otherwise, 50 people is a lot if everybody starts talking at the same time. So if you could please sort of either in the chat or the Q&A section, just put in your name and say, I have a question, or you can type the question and I'll call it out, whatever is easier. And also just a reminder that I forgot to mention before, we sent out a reminder last night for this webinar, and it did include the handout, which has all the important points of this presentation from both Suzanna and Cristina. So you can refer to that. You know, if you didn't take notes and you still have questions after this, you can go back to the handout and, you know, of course, let us know if you want to share any information, if you want to the contact information for Cristina and Suzanna, of course. So the first question that I have, well, the only question that I have at the moment is what do we do if we have tried really hard to normalize and encourage our kids to do self-care for themselves and they continue to resist? My kids think I'm a broken record and get frustrated and angry when I try to suggest, model, etc. for them. That was the only question that I got. So I'll wait and see if we get some other ones.
Do you want to start, Suzanna?
Go ahead, Cristina.
Okay, I'm just, I have been helping somebody with this situation, and we had a conversation about it yesterday, so it's quite fresh in my mind. And it's not exactly what the parent wants to hear, but it is what I believe. I'm assuming this person obviously is talking about a teenager, and unfortunately I want to bring us back to the notion of individuating. And if you as the mom stand for health, wellness, exercising, getting outside every day for your walk, and you jam that agenda down your teenager's throat, guess what your teenager is going to do in response? And I'm sorry to tell you that, but it is so consistent. The teenager says, oh, mom loves that? No, thanks. I'm not going to do that. So I'd love to ask you, the person who asked this question, it's a great question. I'd love to ask you, could you run an experiment in your home? Could you imagine that you put duct tape on your mouth for 7 days around the topic of wellness, exercise, getting outside, taking good care of yourself? Could you just let it go for 7 days and see if there's any shift, any change whatsoever? I always go back to potty training. When we wanted our kids to poop on the potty and we said, come on, poop, let's go. I'll give you an M&M. No poop. The minute we walk away and we go do the dishes or we go look at something else, we hear the plop, plop. And we're like, oh, finally. Because they noticed that we were no longer invested in that particular task. And I hate to compare teenagers to little ones learning to potty train, but there's a lot of similarities.
Okay, I have another couple of questions. Questions for, sorry, I'm trying to go in order. I'm going back up. I am a mom of 2 tweens, aged 12, 6th graders at CMS. Will you address this age group? Oh, this was a while ago, I'm sorry. Is there anything, I guess the question was, I'm sorry, I didn't see that during the chat. Is there specifically something that is different for the middle school group, I guess is the question, versus high school? Because I guess 12 is sort of tweens, not quite teens. So is there a different approach to that question?
I guess it depends. You know, I always want to look at birth order, and I think she's saying these are the oldest kids in her home, I think. But I'm always going to start at, do they have older siblings or not? If they don't, and these are the oldest kids in the house, then I'm probably going to tone down my conversation around the coronavirus. I'm probably going to build a bigger safety bubble around what's happening in the home to protect them against the external world and the onslaught of news. I don't know if she was asking pertaining to managing the news or not. I don't know. Suzanna, do you have something to add?
No, I think you're absolutely right. That just developmentally, they just need to feel more security in the home and be more protected. I don't know if it's possible to contain screen time and just, you know, what's coming into the home as well. And again, just togetherness of family meals. They're sort of burgeoning out to their friends and wanting that, but the security of home is still really, really important.
Here I am again. I also think that if people want to speak, they can request to be unmuted, I believe. In the meanwhile, I'm just going to go through the questions. A bunch of people have asked me in the Q&A, where can we get the handout? And as I mentioned, it did go out last night in the email from the Greenwich High School PTA that also had the reminder for this webinar. If anybody can't find it or you lost the email, obviously we will resend, and we have recorded this session, so I believe we will make it available to parents. I'm probably via email. I will, again, we will follow up for sure. A couple people asked, Suzanna mentioned a mantra she put on her fridge. Could you please repeat that?
The mantra is for everyone to be responsible for the energy that they bring into the room. So just really being self-aware of what you're walking in with, if you're feeling anxious, angry, happy, sad, and acknowledging to yourself at least that affects everybody else too. So not that you don't want to have your feelings be in the room, but you have to be aware of your own feelings, and then they can be appropriately addressed.
I'm just reading back. Sorry, the chat for some reason was behind. I wasn't seeing it while you guys were presenting. It says, I love all of Cristina's strategies and thoughts, and now I'm thinking I've said some wrong things up to now. Will the kids just think I am losing it if I'm saying things like it seems to be the expert adults are doing their job? If they have already seen and heard me panic and maybe exhibit panic, that doesn't reflect that statement. I feel like I've lost some credibility at this point, and they will question and discount this new way of thinking. So I guess the question there is, how do you recoup from from sort of,
Yeah.
you know, losing it essentially, right? I mean, I think we've all lost our mind in the past few weeks. So
I actually love that question. Thank you for that. I think that's a great question. And I think it has to go back to that really corny saying name it to tame it. And I think if we can have the courage to be vulnerable in front of our kids, what are we modeling? We're modeling in our family, we talk about hard feelings. We apologize if apologies are necessary, and we name the truth. So to be able for this particular person to go back to her teenagers and say, you know, I think I was kind of out of line, or I think I panicked, or is all normal. And to be able to say to the kids, you know what, that is the response that I had. And now that I've gotten a little bit of time to learn more information, to protect myself, to calm down, I look back and say like, okay, I wish I hadn't panicked, but I'm a human and I have big feelings because humans have big feelings. So I did panic. But you know what, you guys, I'm feeling better now because I've learned all of these strategies to take care of myself and to help you guys take care of yourselves. So it's feeling better. What do you guys think? But now you've named it. It's not the elephant in the room. The other thing I say to my kids all the time, I have a 20-year-old and I say all the time, by the way, I've never been the parent of a 20-year-old before. So I'm going to mess up all over the place, just like you're going to mess up all over the place. That's to me like mutual respect in a relationship between a parent and a child. Susanna, what else?
Yeah, just to add to that, and I love everything you're saying, Christina, it's spot on. But also just good enough parenting it's good enough. Like if we're perfect parents, in a way we don't give our kids first of all, we can't be, it's just not possible. But we also, in that good enough parenting, we give the kids the chance to be resilient as well. So everything Christina said about acknowledging, being in the truth of yourself, making repair if that's needed, but you know, knowing we're human, acknowledging, like Christina said, our humanness is so important because it allows our kids to be human too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just going back, sorry, there's a few things came in. We mentioned the mantra. How do we handle when, and I think there's a couple of questions sort of around this topic of teenagers or just children or teen tweens being negative. So when they do walk into the room with negative energy, what are some strategies to make that shift? Either of you both answer. It wasn't specific to anyone.
Do you want to start, Cristina?
Sure, I'll start. The very first thing that comes to my mind is something that I had to do with my 20-year-old when she first got sent home from college because of the quarantine. She had a big dark cloud hanging over her head. I don't think she would mind that I'm sharing that. It was clear to all of us and to her. And we ended up, it's like Suzanna was talking about, she would bring this kind of heavy cloud into the room with her. So one strategy I used, and it worked, I'm not saying it's going to work every time, but I sat down with her one evening when I was very calm and relaxed. And I said, you know, I've noticed that you're having a really hard time. How many more days do you think you need to feel sad? And I put her in the driver's seat of her emotions. And she looked at me kind of funny and she was like, well, and it was a reminder that there was a little choice happening in the perpetuating of this mood. A little, not a ton. And she said, I think I need about 2 more days. And I said, have at it. It's all yours. I give you 2 more days. I won't bother you. I won't try to cajole you into being in a better. If you need 2 more days to carry around this dark cloud, I get it. And I left her alone. Obviously, I checked in like, you want to talk? Nope. Okay. But we made an agreement that by Monday morning, she would lift herself out of this place. But I gave her control of the situation. And I think that's what teenagers need to feel. It's perceived control maybe, but it's control.
And then just add to that, it's also just being with your kids in this. As Cristina was talking earlier when she gave her part of the talk, it's just how are you authentically with your kids and their feelings. And this is tough stuff that we're going through. And there is so much loss for them at this age that they're not getting things that are completely developmentally appropriate, you know, college experiences, high school experiences. I mean, this is just things that they've looked forward to. They've worked so hard for years of high school to get to a certain place, and then to have this taken away or stress added because you're worried about college coming up, and just sitting there and being with them and just loving them through it. That's it. Just being present, not trying to convince them to have other feelings, but just being open and curious.
And then here I have a specific question. It says, for Cristina, I understand your comment on sit and let them grieve with what's happening now and the loss, I think it says. My freshman keeps telling me he's fine, no opening up. Thoughts, open-ended questions still results in little for an answer. I guess that they're saying it's an open-ended question, but like thoughts in general about if they say everything is fine and they're not, what can you do?
It's a great question. It's a complicated question to answer without knowing a ton about the kid. But in general, I would say this: there are plenty of kids out there who are not emotive. They are not comfortable. Either it's not their capacity, it's not their skill set to emote, to share their feelings, or they have somehow maybe picked up along the way, either in the culture they live in, the family, the school, the peer group, that they are not meant to be emotive. So the first thing that I would suggest is modeling and being a person in your home who, not excessively, because teenagers will find that annoying, but at least a little bit once in a while saying, my gosh, I saw this unbelievable video. It absolutely choked me up. It was so dreadful to see. Modeling, this is how we share our human response to the reality that's happening. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. What would you add, Suzanna?
Basically that, but also just kids who are less emotive, like you said, it's the antithesis for kids who are more emotive. You sort of want to rise up. Like if they're talking in a very monotone voice about something that they might be angry about, then maybe just putting in, not saying, why aren't you angry, but saying, wow, that really, hurts me. I remember when I had something similar experience, and just using your tone of voice to add energy to it. So again, it's another type of modeling that you're doing.
Okay, I think I have a couple more questions. I'm trying to go in order as much as possible because they're coming in the chat and the Q&A. My son is very risk adverse, and I'm concerned that he is going to have a hard time going back into the world when it starts to open up. Do you have advice for parents who have kids who don't want to go out and socialize with their friends, possibly out of fear?
You want to go first, Cristina?
You go ahead, Suzanne.
Okay. I'm sure Cristina will have more to add to this, but I think I think a lot of people are going to feel this way. So first of all, I would normalize it for your son, that he's not the only one. There's certainly a lot of kids and adults that are going to feel this way. And, again, I would just talk about it in a way of like, how do we make ourselves feel safe doing this? How do we put a toe in the water? So even now, up before we're fully going back in the world, we're going to grocery stores and things like that. If you feel safe and if you feel okay about it, what would it be like to bring your son, with a mask on, if he's willing to do it, or even just talk about it? So sort of start talking about what next steps would be. So trying to take baby steps through this, put your toe in the water, starting now in small ways, while having him feel connected to you, because he's going to feel much safer from that place, and being authentically with him in his feelings. But in a way, so our kids are naturally scared, and we have to sometimes push them a little forward, gently, but push them forward. Cristina, what do you have to add?
I would add, in the same vein, we have to push them forward, but at the same time, we have to be able, obviously, to listen to them. And it reminds me of that notion of everybody grieves differently. Mm-hmm. So my style of reentry and the pace at which I might choose to go that's comfortable for me might actually be very different for one of my kids. And I'm thinking about my 3 kids are 3 very, very different people, and their style of reentry will all look very different. And one thing I'm always working on, certainly with my teenagers, is not making my way the way they have to do it, because there's nothing that leads more quickly to fracturing a relationship with a teenager. So I might have to dig very deep for patience and empathy, and to be able to say, okay, I get it. You're not ready yet. Do you want to try again in 2 days? And in terms of going to the grocery store, let's say if you have a child who's very nervous, right? I'm not going to give up, but I'm going to maybe let the amount of time, the frequency with which I nag them, maybe I'll give a little bit more space. I want them to know they're in the driver's seat. Again, for me, a lot working with families with teenagers, it's so much about perceived control. And when the teenager believes they have control. They might not necessarily actually, but when they believe they do, they tend to be more compliant.
I think. That,
oh,
yeah.
sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we're going to take two more questions, which is actually all I have left on the chat, just because we were supposed to end at 8:15. It's 8:22. But so the last two questions is, well, so one says, says, can you touch on the effects of sleep patterns? I think we all know that our teenagers have been getting up late, going to bed late. So I think in general, if you could sort of address, I guess, I'm not sure, sleep patterns, how they affect the kids, or I'm not sure what the question is, or if, what can we do about it? And then there's one more question at the end that after you talk. And then after that, we're not going to take any more questions just because it's getting late.
Suzanna, you want to take that?
I would just say that in some ways this is a blessing. So, you know, it depends on what sleep patterns are, but if they have a regular sleep pattern, you know, our teenagers are being asked to wake up way too early in the morning to go to school. It's not their normal sleep pattern. When they go to college, they have a completely different sleep pattern, which is much more conducive for them, for their mental health, for their physical health, for all of it. So I would sort of look at it under that lens. If you're seeing a disrupted sleep pattern because of anxiety, that's another thing. Cristina had a lot of good thoughts. Maybe you want to address that piece of that.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I might say to my kid, and again, it's always about timing and make sure they're not hungry and they're not rushing, and you aren't either, but you know, just to be able to give a very non-judgmental, I always think about holding a mirror up and together you look in the mirror like, hey, I've noticed that. And then it's just fill in the blank. So for this one, I've noticed that your sleep seems to be kind of off. I see your light on, you know, whatever. Not that you should be up at 2 a.m, but whatever. You see their light on at inappropriate times, or you notice they're texting it, you know, and just start with, I've noticed that, and name the behavior. And then the second strategy, the second part of that is, what's going on for you? And then you just get really quiet. And you do not stuff your preconceived parental notions down their throat. You just get really quiet. And sometimes it'll be really annoying because they'll go, nothing. And that's all you get. And other times you get more. If you get the nothing, you can gently, in a little tiny way, suggest something and see if they reject it or it draws them closer. But that's how I would start it off, with the I've noticed that, and then what's going on, and then get really quiet.
So the last question is actually a very good question. And I think for a lot of us, this will probably, it's about kids, but it's also about spouses. And just before I ask this last question, because once you answer this, I think we'll say our goodbyes. Just to remind everybody that again, the handout is available. If you have not received it, cannot find it, please send an email to the PTA. We will send it to you. Our goal is to put this recording on the PTA website for Greenwich High. Once it's on, we will let everybody know that it's there. So thank you to everybody for participating. We had over 50 people at one point, so that's a very good turnout. And thank you to both of you once again for being here. So the last question, what if your most difficult child is your spouse and they're nervous and worried about global markets and economic stuff, and they are not the least concerned with the anxiety they bring to the room during heated conference calls for work or rants about the economy and the Dow Jones? So that's the question. So how do you, I guess, just take away that negative energy from the room?
That one's a tricky one, especially if the person is unaware. So, you know, it depends on the level of this and all of that. I certainly want to, maybe if that person has a separate work area so they're not affecting everybody, that would be one way of very practically addressing it. But again, my whole thing is connectedness, is that I believe that, in fact, I know for a fact that a lot of people have a very small capacity to take in the connectedness, and that sort of has to grow out over time, both with our, you know, sort of more reserved children and often with our spouses. And so, as Cristina was saying, in a very gentle way, you just like very slightly go in and find ways of connecting. Often that you know, for men, often that anxiety comes from, it's actually a place of love, of wanting to take care of their family and really being frightened that they're not going to be able to do that in the current economic environment, and letting them know how much you appreciate them and how hard they're trying, even though they may be getting on your last nerve, is a way of sort of helping them come forward towards you. And then just watch and listen. You might not get a response that you want immediately, but just look for the tiniest thing. That's a glimmer, and then go in again the next day and keep repeating, so that ability to take in your love and that connectedness increases. And then that over time will lower their anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Excellent suggestions. And I think the one thing I might add is just kind of that traditional psychology 101 phrase, when you do X, it makes me feel Y. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that some people don't have as much self-awareness. So they bring that angst or that worry about the external world into the home or into the kitchen conversation, because it's very real for them. In their world, it is absolutely significant and relevant, but they lack the awareness to understand, when you speak like that, in that tone of voice about this information, there's a trickle down effect on all of the other people in the room. And then just being able to speak for yourself. When you speak like that, it makes me feel whatever, worried, anxious, sad, scared. But, you know, obviously this is a one-on-one conversation, not in front of your kids, in a time where your spouse is able to hear, when he is available to hear you, which is going to be a small sliver of time. It's all about choosing the right time. And I agree. I love what you said, Suzanna, about it is connection, right? The whole reason we're here is to build and deepen our connections. I want to just quickly say, if I've been posting on my Instagram what I'm calling endurance parenting tips. So if you're on Instagram, you can follow me at CMY Therapy. It's also on the handout, but I'd love to see you. And if there's any further questions you want to post there, I'd love to answer them. Thank you so much for this evening. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you both, Suzanna.
Thank you so much.
And there's a bunch of comments that, you know, you can read them. I don't know if you can read them while you're busy, but thank you so much. Great webinar. Like, we've gotten some really, really great feedback from our parents. And so we can't thank you enough for taking the time and being so resourceful and helpful. And I think you'll probably have a lot of follow-up, because I'm sure a lot of people, one of the people said, I want Cristina to come parent my children. And then, you know, both of you, you know, there's so many great comments. So we can't thank you enough.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great night.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.